This is Professor JPS, and this is March 31st, 2020, Tuesday. This is a lecture for Communication Arts 101, Section 2, Tuesday evenings. So last week we had done a quick advertising look-through for the last chapter before Test 2, which I will review for Test 2 right now in today's lecture. And then what I will do is, after this lecture, I will email the test out to you, and then you will have till, say, Friday night at midnight to finish the exam. Okay? So what we have to review for today is the television chapter, the advertising chapter, and the newspaper chapter. Okay? First of all, I hope that everyone is getting all the emails I've been sending. Although we only meet once a week, I have been sending through spring break and last week emails as to what to look forward to in these lectures. And please look to your NCC email addresses. I don't have all of your personal email addresses. Through the banner system, we only have the NCC email addresses. So make an attempt to link your personal email to your NCC email. It's really quite important. Okay. So let me go back and discuss some aspects of the television chapter. Television was the first thing we're going to be discussing for the examination, which I'll send to you later through email. Just in terms of what I think you should pay attention for the textbook, and I'll go over some more aspects of it. The television chapter, take a look at pages 368 and 369. 368 and 369 give a kind of timeline for the history of television up until just a few years ago. You don't have to memorize that aspect. Don't freak out. I'm not going to pull specific information from that particular timeline. It gives you a sense of the history of television. Just look through it, read through it for your own education, your own edification. You don't have to memorize it or feel as though you're going to have to need to know that for the exam. It's not exactly what I mean. It just gives you some background material, gives you a sense of some of the things that have happened historically in television. Okay. More specific aspects of television, I'd like you to look at page 371 and look over on the sidebar about the idea of syndication. Syndication, you may remember, are television programs that are not necessarily distributed by the four major networks. They could be on many different kinds of channels, and there are shows that are usually not in prime time, but they are syndicated out to different stations around the country. Okay, the key idea with syndication is it's by a market basis. You may remember we discussed television markets. Television markets are not necessarily just the city in which a television station is in, but a television market is the area in which you live in. So for instance, even though we live in Connecticut, we're mainly part of the New York market because we're in southwestern Connecticut near the New York border. So television and radio stations that emanate from New York City are part of our market, even though we don't live in New York City. So markets usually are generated out from large urban centers, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Boston, what have you. But a market is an area in which is covered. And syndication, the decision as to how syndication works is made on a market-by-market basis. And that's a key idea, and you can look for that definition on page 371. Okay? Syndication, 371. Also on page 374 is the idea of a network affiliate. A network affiliate. A network affiliate is just the local version of the national network. The four major national networks are housed primarily in Los Angeles, and sometimes their offices are also in New York. But they produce the shows, the cop shows, the reality shows, the sitcoms. They make the product, right? They make the shows themselves and distribute them all throughout the country. But it's the affiliates in the local markets that end up showing them to their own local areas. So affiliate is just the local version of the national network. And 9 times out of 10, the affiliate will show what the national network has produced because the national network actually produces programming. The affiliate just shows the programming. The affiliate does not really have too many ways to make programming. Occasionally they have some local programming that they'll put on. But by and large, the network affiliate is just a local version of the national network. And that aspect can be further explored on page 375. On page 374, I'd like you to look at the distinction between commercial and non-commercial stations, what that means, and what the examples are. A commercial station is a station that supports itself by selling its airtime to advertisers, so advertisers can make commercials and try to sell you things. So most television stations are commercial stations. That is to say, they're selling their airtime in between their programming to make money, to make a profit. And therefore, the programming they make has to be suitable for advertisers to then interrupt that programming. So, for instance, if you watch a television show tonight, I don't know, what's it, Tuesday night? I don't even know what's on television on Tuesday night anymore, but say you watch a reality television show, there's going to be commercials that interrupt that reality television show. And those commercials can be from many different kinds of aspects of commercial life. But the network is making their money by selling that airtime to commercials. Non-commercial stations are supported by tax dollars, supported by donations, and supported by corporations who will underwrite and give them some money to just say that we've sponsored this. But there are no explicit advertisements on public television. Public television, where you, as a child, used to watch Sesame Street or maybe watch some nature programming or something. But public television, or PBS, is television that's without profit. It's educational. It's also entertaining. It's informational. It's aspirational. I think the public television's news is actually pretty good because they're not trying to make a profit out of it. That's also on page 374. So I want you to make sure you have a sense of the distinctions between commercial stations and non-commercial stations and why and what examples of them, okay? So that's primarily what we're interested in terms of the television chapter. The last thing about television chapter that's quite important has to do with ratings and shares. Now, the textbook definition of ratings and shares I don't like. That's why I gave out that handout in class. I hope you'll be able to hold on to that handout and remember from the notes what it's all about. I'll go over it a little bit right now. Everyone thinks that ratings means the amount of people that are watching a television program, which is a decent guess. But technically, that's not what ratings are, nor what shares are. You may remember we talked about the Nielsen Corporation. The Nielsen Corporation is a corporation that's hired by the television networks to measure audience participation, audience viewership. The Nielsen Corporation every day has a very carefully calculated estimate or guess as to how many people are watching television every day. And how they do it is they measure roughly 5,000 families every day. Those families change, ongoing. But they're picked from a wide demographic, a range of demographics to represent the entire country. So it's a very, very small sample size. It's only 5,000 people, but chosen very carefully through algorithms that I don't understand. I don't have the mathematical ability to understand that. But it's a statistical estimate as to how many people are watching television. So you may remember when we discussed this with the handout made it a little easier to comprehend, is that the amount of people watching a television program out of the entire survey sample size is the rating. The amount of people watching a television show out of the entire survey sample size is the rating. And the amount of people watching a television show out of all of the people watching television at the time is the share. Right? So, if, for instance, on a typical evening of 5,000 people being metered by the Nielsen Corporation, if 5,000 people are being metered by the Nielsen Corporation and 4,000 television are actually in use at that time, actually turned on, and 1,000 people are watching whatever show we're talking about, that means 1,000 people out of 5,000 is the rating. 1,000 out of 5,000, the amount of people watching our chosen show out of the entire survey sample size, that's the rating. It's not an exact number. It's a very, very calculated statistical estimate as to how many people are watching a television show out of the entire survey sample size. The share is the amount of people watching that program, 1,000, out of the amount of televisions that are actually on, or what they call in use at that time. So if there's 5,000 in the overall sample size and 4,000 televisions are actually on, the 1,000 number is out of 4,000 is the share. In other words, 4,000 televisions are on, 1,000 people are watching our show, whatever that show is, and 3,000 people are watching something else. You're sharing that space. So the number that they're really interested in, both the programmers, the producers and programmers, and also the advertisers, is the share. That's because you're seeing how well you're doing against your competition. Okay? This should be in your notes, and it is in that handout that I had given you. A rating is the amount of people watching a show out of the entire survey sample size. The share is how many people are watching a show out of the number of televisions that are actually in use in the survey sample size. And how this affects advertisers is very, very important. Well, how does it affect advertisers? Advertisers want to see shows that have high ratings and high shares, so they can then buy advertising time for shows that have a lot of people watching them at one time. And then if you can't afford that, then you go down to the next level and you buy advertising time when you feel like your audience is going to be watching it. And that's determined during what's called sweeps weeks or sweeps months. Remember, sweeps weeks and sweeps months. 4 times a year where the advertising community and the network community come together to discuss the price of commercials, how much the television networks are going to charge the advertisers for airtime for those 8 minutes out of every half hour of commercials. Okay? Those 4 months are August, November, February, and May. Okay? 4 times a year. So ratings and shares are quite important in terms of TV. Okay? In terms of the advertising chapter, advertising, I think you want to make sure you look at page 91 for just the basic definition of advertising. Okay, page 91 for the basic definition of advertising. And then also page 92 for the definition of ad agencies, which are agencies that are about making the creative output of ads. They don't own the products, they just sell the products. Also branding, page 98. Branding on page 98. We discussed this in last week's video and going over advertising. And the very idea of commercialism itself on page 115 in the textbook. Page 115 in the textbook. Those should help you in terms of the exam I'm going to write up for today, and then you'll have till Friday to finish that exam. The other key idea is not so much in the textbook, but it has to do with Sigmund Freud and his theory of the subconscious mind and subliminal advertising. Now, this is right when we were discussing things and school shut down. Let me just go over it again one more time. Sigmund Freud was interested in this idea of things that were in the back of our heads, the back of our minds. We have a conscious mind, we're aware, we can learn, we can think, we can feel, we can understand. But then there's this subconscious part of our mind. Sometimes it's revealed in dreams when we have dreams that we can't explain or dreams that are very strange. Freud would say that's our subconscious mind telling us a deeper truth about ourselves. Okay? So with Freud, he broke the subconscious mind into three categories. Well, really two main categories. The id, spelled ID, the id, which represents all subconscious desires, regardless of consequence. The part of us that just wants. The part of us that may not necessarily be the best part of ourselves, but the part that's a bit selfish, the part that needs and wants things. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be, that extra beer you shouldn't have, or that extra scoop of ice cream you shouldn't have, or the idea that you should sleep in an extra hour, or all kinds of desires, sensual desires, sexual desires, desires to be bullheaded and pushy and whatever. And then there's the opposite of that, which is he referred to as the superego. And the superego is part of us that kind of tempers or calms down, tempers or calms down our id. It's the opposite of the id. It's the conscience of the subconscious, if you like. Okay. Excuse me. So those two things are always sort of in competition with one another. And the balance between those two things is referred to as the ego. So when someone has a big ego, what we really mean is they have a large id that hasn't been restrained at all by the superego. And why this is valuable or interesting to advertisers is that subliminal advertising taps into your id, our id. Subliminal advertising is advertising that is subconsciously tapping into our desires. We may or may not even be aware that the things that happen in some of these advertisements are subconscious. Now, last week, I asked you to look at Google Images and look at subliminal advertising. There's one advertisement from if you look carefully at a Joe Camel ad. Joe Camel is a cigarette advertisement company, and in the ad is just this series of ads where it's just a camel who acts kind of cool, right? Technically, it was supposed to try to tap into young boys who were 12, 13 years old to try to get them to smoke earlier and earlier, although they would never admit that. But subliminally, what was happening on Joe Camel's face, if you look carefully, that his nose is always prominently featured in the front, and his nose runs down in a very phallic-like imagery, penis-shaped imagery. And if you look at his nostrils are flared up this way, and it almost looks as if his nostrils are like a female body part, like a vagina, and the nose itself looks like a male body part, of a penis, entering into a vagina on Joe Camel's face. Now, when you look at it, you think, oh, that's crazy. But the more you look at it, the more you can kind of see that it's there. It's there and not there simultaneously. This happens all of the time in advertising, where products themselves are situated in a semi-sexual way that you would never really see them as sexual unless it's pointed out to you. Okay? That's an idea of subliminal advertising that's tapping into subconscious desires. It's tapping into the id. You may not even be aware of it, right? But once you start to see it happen more and more, and you can see some of those in the Google Images, there's all kinds of aspects of sensuality and sexuality. But these subliminal advertising isn't necessarily just subliminal for sexual purposes. That happens to be a kind of a strong marker in advertising. But sometimes it's not even sexual. If you look at a FedEx logo, and if you look between the E and the X, there's an arrow that's there. If you look away, it just looks like a white spot. But if you concentrate, it looks like an arrow. It's subliminally placed in there to subconsciously remind you that FedEx is on its way, that it's heading somewhere. The Amazon swerve up is another subconscious sense that things are going to be moving quickly. That happens with great frequency. The Wendy's hamburger joint, there's a little like a shirt collar that goes across the young Wendy's face, or under her head, under her neck. And if you look carefully, it spells out the word mom to subliminally suggest that it's home cooking. This kind of stuff happens all the time in advertising, okay? It's trying to tap into what Freud suggested was subconscious desires. When I say desires, I don't just mean sexual desires or sensual desires, although that's part of it. It has to do with desires generally, okay? And we went over this right before the class, the school was shut down. So just keep that in mind, okay? I would go to Google Images if you didn't last week to double check that idea. But that's also, in terms of the review, very, very important. In terms of the newspaper chapter that we just went over last week, I want you to pay careful attention again to the timeline on pages 222 and 223. You don't have to go crazy on the timeline. Just get a sense of it, read through it, try to absorb some of it if you can. It just gives you a kind of purview for how important newspapers had been and in fact still are. On pages 225 and 226, they talk about newspaper chains, chain newspapers that tried to stem the tide of newspapers' viewership going way, way down and many newspapers closing. Get a sense of those. Again, it's only 2 pages, so you can get a sense of it. Also, 229 and 230, mostly 229. Pages 229 and 230 talk about classified advertisements and the diminishment of classified advertisements in newspapers in contemporary times. I'll return to that in a moment or two when I want to discuss some of the aspects of newspapers. And pages 241 and 242 deal with the future of journalism, the future of newspapers / journalism. A real key idea to this particular chapter that's not really in a textbook, but something I discussed a little bit last week in last week's video, has to do with the 2 technological changes that really, really, really affected newspaper readership, okay, and newspaper circulation. Now, you may remember circulation is just a fancy word for how many newspapers have been sold, okay? So newspapers had pretty robust circulations all through the 1940s, all through the 1950s, all through the 1960s, and pretty well through the 1970s. But you may remember there was one technological change in the 1950s that started to affect newspaper readership, and that was television. Television really got going in about 1952, and then, well, 48 to 52 was initial stages of television. By 55, most Americans had television. Certainly by the mid-60s, television was, you know, a very important part of American life. Now, I mentioned to you last week that the way in which television started to get newspaper readers to leave newspapers and go to television were with big world-changing events that happened through the 1960s. Starting really with Kennedy's assassination in '63, the Vietnam War all through the 60s, and really most particularly the Civil Rights Movement, which was on television all the time. But also the sort of hippie movements, the anti-war demonstrations, the sexual revolution, the moon landing. There were a lot of big events that made enough people start to put down their newspapers and start going to television. But the change was gradual. It was a much more gradual change between viewers getting their news from television, viewers getting news from newspapers to moving from television. Every half decade or so, you'd see a gradual shift of people not reading newspapers anymore. But it was still relatively robust until the mid to late 70s. By about 1980, some newspapers started to close. But it wasn't that big of a problem in terms of journalism and newspaper survival. Television, people had gotten used to it, but the people who were going to read television and the people who were going to watch television, they kind of got their numbers right, right? So all through the 70s and into the 80s, there was some gradual newspaper viewership decline, but it was just that. It was much more gradual and slow. By the early 1990s, and particularly with the development of the World Wide Web and newspapers going online, that shift was much quicker, because television kind of coincided with newspapers. But the internet and later digital media, it just cut the legs out under newspapers quite quickly, mainly because the internet was faster, and for a while, until there were firewalls put up, cheaper. It was essentially free. But the key reason that the internet really diminished newspaper circulation was because the internet stole or took away. They didn't steal it. They just did it a different way. They took classified advertising. Classified advertising was really important to newspapers because that's where everybody would put lists for jobs or apartments or personal ads or what are those things called? It's tag sales or whatever, and they'd have to pay newspapers every month for all of these ads. That's gone now from newspapers. I mean, unless you get like a small local paper and you want to buy a car or used car, or you're looking to see if there's any local things that you could look up, local positions, or looking for a babysitter or something like that. But in general, all of that stuff is on Craigslist or other many different kinds of lists. So right away, that took away newspapers' ability to have their business model. They had to restart it. And many newspapers have closed in the past 10 or 15 years. And newspaper chains tried for a while, but they did not really succeed. Newspapers, until we're completely off print and onto all on the internet, newspapers are not necessarily that long for this world, I think. But we're still in a period of transition from one to another. But the two main technological changes were television, which was much more gradual, that took newspaper readership away, but the internet and digital media, and by the time when there was a World Wide Web in the mid to late 90s, newspapers really suffered, and then many of them have perished. They just they don't have a business model to keep up. The bigger ones survive, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and some of the other ones have rich benefactors who help pay for it. Like Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. And he doesn't really care if it makes money or not because he has so much money. But journalism is still very, very important. Whether you get it from the internet, whether you get it from the radio, whether you get it from television, whether you get it from Facebook, whether you get it from print newspapers, journalism is still very, very important. And it's just where it is we get our journalism that's different, okay? Also, another thing about the newspapers you should just keep in mind is that the First Amendment of the Constitution is an important idea. The freedom of the press is an important idea. And that we keep trying to make sure that we speak truth to power. It's a very, very important idea. One other aspect that is a carryover from last unit, has to do with product placement. We talked a little bit about product placement in the film unit, although we've already been tested for the film unit. We weren't tested on that. So just have a sense of understanding what product placements are. Product placements are paid advertisements that are put into stories and films. They're not actually advertisements, but they work almost like advertisement when a character in a film is prominently displaying a Starbucks cup or prominently displaying some sort of branded object. There's a relationship between the Hollywood studios system and advertising community to place products within stories and within films. And to some degree, I think it cheapens the movies themselves because it sort of takes a time out for a product to be noticed, and then we get back to the scene. You've grown up with them. I mean, my favorite example is Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. I mean, it's in the title of the movie, the actual commercial product. Anyway, please look out for your emails. Please, please, please link. your NCC emails to your personal email account. I don't have everybody's personal email account. I only have what the banner system allows us to have, and that's your NCC email account. And if I'm pretty sure most of you have been getting these. I have like over 100 students this semester, so it's kind of hard to know. So email me with any questions. I'm going to finish this right now. I'm going to go write up the test and email it to all of you. You have till Friday at midnight to complete it. But please send all your answers in an attachment, okay? A Word attachment somehow, okay? The key is to stay in touch. Also, please don't, I imagine you know this by now, please make sure you're taking this seriously, this corona thing. Norwalk has been hit particularly hard in the past 3-4 days. If you have to go out, if you're going to the post office, if you're going to the drugstore, if you're going to a supermarket, wear gloves, and then as soon as you get to go in your car, remove the gloves and use hand sanitizer. Immediately wash your hands when you go home. Do not touch your face. If you wear glasses, when you get home, wipe this part of your glasses, this part of your glasses, this part of your glasses. I mean, you do not want to mess around with this. We'll all get through this together, but the young people particularly, you can't hang out. I'm sorry, you can't. You can't go to your buddy's house and play video games. You can't do it. So please don't. Take walks or whatever. Get out of the house if you can, but you have to make sure that you're doing this. Please stay safe, and email me with any questions. Okay. Let me just double check one more time. Oh, also one other thing. Remember what a cross-platform deal is. It's not in the textbook. It was in my head, and we talked about it right before class ended. It was NCC shut down. A cross-platform deal is a deal between advertisers and large media corporations, and for the advertiser to utilize that corporation's as many holdings as possible that corporation has. You may remember my stupid example of me selling my brand of Shield sweaters through Disney. So if I were to make an advertisement across all their platforms, it would be the Disney Channel, ABC, ESPN, all of ESPN radio, Disney magazines, ABC radio, all across those platforms. That's what a cross-platform deal is, okay? It used to be in the textbook. It no longer is, okay? All right. Okay. Also, just, be careful to read the directions. I asked for examples, okay? And to examine something. My one-on-one class the other day, a lot of them just wrote 1 or 2 sentences. Like, you need more information, okay? And you'll have plenty of time to do it. Okay. Stay safe, and thank you.